What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the re-review for Greedfall. The original title, followed up soon by its sequel, Greedfall: The Dying World, and that sequel is exactly why I'm taking a look back at this AA RPG that I would say firmly falls into the category of Eurojank, an affectionate term for ambitious RPGs that don't quite have the scale or funding to really see their vision to full fruition. Now, Greedfall is an interesting title for the channel in the sense that I am often known for 100% reviews, and I did in fact review Greedfall that way, but Greedfall was my very first one. Though, as a result, it's a bit of an old review, and so the quality of that video is not great, truth be told, so I figured I would simultaneously update that video while also refreshing my own memories of what this game was just before the release of the second game. But with all of that stuff out of the way, let's actually dive fully into this and talk about the game itself now. As I mentioned, Greedfall was an ambitious title that I think had bigger ambitions than it could realistically fulfill. The game itself was developed by Spiders, that is to say the developer Spiders, not literal spiders of course, and they are a developer known for, I would say, smaller in scale RPGs. Things like Bound by Flame, The Technomancer, etc. Of all of those, was their best-selling game by a lot, from what I understand. It kind of entered the mainstream briefly, which got it a lot of attention, namely for the game's unique visuals, as well as interesting mix of things like colonial-era Europe, alongside magic, and really interesting monster designs even. But all of that, however, did kind of cover up the fact that the game honestly has some pretty rough combat, especially as it gets very repetitive very quickly. There's also a lot of rough systems that feel half-baked, honestly. And yet, it still ultimately spoke to some people because at its core, this is a game that I think is probably best described as trying to replicate old BioWare RPGs, and that is simply going to resonate with a fair few people. But I also don't think they really stuck the landing either, and so I think the most noteworthy thing looking back at this game is almost certainly the world and the setting, which makes sense for a sequel, though technically a prequel, by the way. But before we dive into all that, first let's talk about the technical state of this game on PC in 2026. For the most part, ran pretty well. A couple of minor issues, and then one, honestly it was funny more than anything else, more major issue, but I'm not inclined to think it's widespread. So the big problem, I fell through the map this time around. I was up sort of against a rock and a wall, and an enemy did like a knockback attack on me, and it shoved me straight through the wall, and I started falling through the map and had to reload an autosave. I've never had that issue with this game before. It mostly, again, just made me laugh, so apparently that is a thing that is possible these days still. Otherwise, though, no real issue. The occasional bit of like small stuff, clipping. I actually noticed some typos in the subtitles this time around, things like that. So nothing game breaking, seems to run fine, but there's definitely still some minor issues in there that you may have to be aware of or slightly annoyed by, I guess. Which then brings us to the difficulty of this game. This game does feature multiple different difficulties, basically from easy to extreme. As the difficulty goes up, enemies have, more health, more resistances, and you take a lot more damage, and it makes you easier to kill. Pretty basic difficulty system, and what's more, because this is one of the first games I was covering, I did actually post a build for extreme mode all the way back when this game released. That build should still work. It basically revolves around using guns in a kind of cheesy way, but it is nonetheless very effective. Just on the off chance you're looking to beat this game on the hardest difficulty without it being a headache. That, however, brings us to character creation. Character creation for Greedfall is really very simple because while there is a cosmetic character creation, a couple things to know. One, you will always play a character who is the legate of the merchant congregation known as D. Sardet. This is because that is the family you hail from within the merchant's congregation, and you have a sort of set role within the universe. What you can do, however, is make minor adjustments to your character's appearance. This customization is relatively limited, and there is a sort of odd-looking patch on the left side of your face that has to be there as part of the main story, which we'll get to in a moment. So simply put, there is a little bit of customization, yes, but don't get too excited, frankly. You can also pick a preset like me if you're lazy. From there, character creation comes to picking between warrior, technical, or magic. This determines your starting skills and abilities. It is relatively important. Basically, do you want to do big melee weapons, magic rings, or alchemy and guns being the technical one? This is an important decision, mind you, but not an irreversible one either. From there, you're going to pick your attributes. There are 6 attributes, basically the stuff you would expect: strength, accuracy, agility, that kind of stuff. And typically speaking, what these attributes will do is increase your damage with the given thing. Mental power increases your damage with magic rings, which is the weapon you equip to use magical attacks. Agility gives you extra damage with one-handed and two-handed bladed weapons. Strength gives you more damage for like heavy and blunt weapons, that kind of thing. Accuracy gives you better damage with guns, etc. So just kind of pick the attribute that is going to coincide with what you want to do. Now at a max level, you'll be able to max out about 2.5 of these. So don't spread yourself too thin. Then there are your talents. These are effectively skills that you will use out in the world or in conversation. This is going to allow you to do stuff. There's craftsmanship as an example. That's going to let you craft and upgrade your gear, and also going to be used in some quest workarounds to save you a little bit of trouble. Intuition is a conversation option one primarily that is going to let you have extra conversation options, which is more or less also the case with charisma, but the difference being that charisma is a % chance to succeed based on your skill level, and then intuition is just a straight up pass or fail. There's also lockpicking, which is self-explanatory, and then the science one will allow you to do things like use alchemical components and things to potentially even set traps if you also have the skills for it. And it's usually a combination of your attributes, talents, and skills that are going to determine how things play out for you, but it's really not a complicated system, so let's go ahead and move on to the story of this one. The story of Greedfall is perhaps the most interesting thing about it, and that is because we start the game on the main continent of, I believe it's called Gakane, something like that. However, we in particular are in a town or city known as Serene. Serene, like much of the continent, is suffering from an outbreak of what they are calling the Malachor, a deadly plague that is absolutely ravaging the continent. However, there is a little bit of hope looking to the future, because the Isle of Tir-Fradee was relatively recently discovered and has been colonized by some of the game's main factions, those being the Congregation of Merchants, the Bridge Alliance, and the Teleme, I'm not entirely sure. But the reason this is so important is for a couple different reasons, actually. For starters, the natives of the island seem to just straight up be immune to this plague, which means obviously they're going there looking for a cure, which is one of the primary reasons you're there, yes. However, there are some secondary reasons. It would seem that the religious faction, Teleme, has stories about what this isle is, and there's answers to be found there in regards to their faith. And let's be honest, there's also plenty of money to be made exploiting the people of the island, especially scattered as they are, in the absence of their high king, who has been missing for a while. Your job as the legate of the merchant congregation is to accompany your cousin, who is going to be appointed the new governor there, in order to sort of ease diplomatic tensions between the different factions on the island as you search for a cure. Along the course of this journey, you're going to learn a lot of things. And now, if you are wanting to avoid spoilers, as this game is technically a sequel to the second game, which is going to be a prequel, you may want to click off now, as the rest of this will be fairly spoiler heavy. With that in mind, let's get into some of the big revelations that you learn over the course of this thing. You see that big weird sort of almost bark-like patch that your character has on their face is because you are not a native of the continent. You are actually descended from the natives on the island, who are much more in tune with nature, almost druids in a lot of cases, which is why you look so much like them, as they often have features like that. This is important because it spells out another thing you will learn, which is that there have been previous expeditions to this island. Multiple times, in fact, you are going to find ruins of places that clearly were not built by the islanders, because they were built by people from the continent who had been here before. Now, curiously, the second game is just 3 years before the events of this one. However, it does seem like it dates much farther back with that, with expeditions potentially even coming here to kidnap people as slaves quite some time ago. But that's especially important because these natives are not just sitting back quietly, or at least not in totality, because there's a bunch of different tribes of the natives. Each of them has a different approach to dealing with the outsiders, and as I mentioned, typically speaking, they would be united under their high king, whose job is to unite the tribes, but that person has been missing for a long time. They just sort of disappeared months before the game began. And yet they are not without their defenses. This is where these giant island guardians come in, who are known as, I believe it's called the Nadag. These are giant guardians that will basically not put up with any sort of intrusions on the island, and over the course of the game you learn that these are in fact natives who have been transformed by bonding with the nature of the island itself, which kind of bleeds into their own religion of an entity that is supposed to be living at the heart of the island, known as In On Mil Frictamen. Now this is especially important because if you remember, the islanders are in fact immune to the Malachor, and they have then found ways to potentially block its spread, which you'll obviously get to the heart of over the course of this story, which I don't want to get into too much here, but there are some other things I want to mention. So this game does play around a good bit with choice and consequence. Some things are going to happen regardless, like for instance, Constantine, he's going to catch the Malachor relatively early into the game, and you're going to have to work on finding that cure even harder for the sake of your cousin. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the big decisions really come down to the factions themselves. So the Congregation of Merchants and many of the other factions are guarded by the Coin Guard, effectively mercenaries, and roughly a third of the way into the game, the Coin Guard tries to perform a coup. How this plays out largely is determined by whether or not you chose to do the side quests for your companion Kurt, who was a member of the Coin Guard previously to this. Moving on from there, your relationships with the different factions, because to be clear, your position as a legate makes you a diplomatic envoy, essentially, which means that your job is to be diplomatic, which does make sort of perfect solutions to problems make more sense. However, how you ultimately treat these individual factions as you move through the game will determine whether or not they help you at the end of it, which can make the final battle, easier or more difficult depending. So, all told, with all of that stuff working in unison, I would say the story of Greedfall is pretty decent. I think the idea of the natives and how they are presented with all the different tribes, the nature of what lies at the heart of the mountain, these people's connection to the land and how all of that works, while also dealing with this Malachor plague, getting to the heart of some of the colonialism themes. It's a decent story in here. It's not really incredible or anything, but it's pretty good for what it is. Which then brings us to the progression side of things. So progression in this game is relatively simple. You're going to earn experience, you're going to level up. As you level up, you gain skill points. You can also get skill points from altars out in the wilderness. You're going to spend those skill points on various skills to make yourself better or acquire new skills perhaps to use. And then every few levels, you're also going to pick up attributes and talents as you go, which will then let you equip better and better gear, or simply explore more of the world. Now there's a little bit more to it than that, but truth be told, the details aren't super interesting. Like for instance, if you have a high craftsmanship, you can alter the gear with various loadouts and stat effects. These are super basic though. There's very little options in terms of those. However, I will point out that it is possible if you really want to min-max to get the most out of your skills by putting extra things on your gear. So you can get a +1, for example, to charisma simply by wearing any of the capes, which is super easy because then you can get to that max of 3 charisma even faster. And then your chest items can also be outfitted with a modification that will increase one of your skills as well, which is another way to do it, or even meet the 1 craftsmanship requirement of certain things. That also applies to other bits of gear, and so there is sort of that element of it. But the stats themselves are honestly kind of boring. It basically comes down to armor, balance, and damage. Balance being, of course, how easy it is to knock your character down, that kind of thing, but combat is often so fast that it just doesn't matter. And then the skills are a mix of interesting and boring things. Some of them are just straight up do extra damage with this kind of thing, yes. However, some of them are a bit more interesting in the sense that you can spend a couple of skill points to, say, get access to the ability to use pistols or rifles. Various kind of dodge extenders, if you will, like a proper dodge roll as opposed to the basic dodge, or a teleport if you are using magic, that kind of thing. But all in all, not terribly exciting, which then brings us to the gameplay and world section. So I guess you could describe Greedfall as a semi-open world title, as it ultimately has about a dozen or so hub areas that you can run around, including 3 different cities belonging to the 3 major factions you'll be dealing with. And in each of those areas, there's a few things to do. Namely, you can find various camps, which will serve as your fast travel points where you can sleep in advance time through the game's day-night cycle, access your storage, which is a handy place to store your unique items, which are going to be the primary thing you're using, as itemization is a little bit boring, or using the workbench there to craft things. Outside of that, the areas you'll be running through are relatively basic besides what there is to see, because the primary thing you're going to be doing there is fighting enemies that can respawn as you leave, or talking to various NPCs and getting the lay of the land for that specific specific bit of the island. There are some other systems, but they are ultimately kind of half-baked and don't come up a ton. This is things like the stealth and costume systems. There is a stealth system in this game, but it's mostly useless because there's no stealth attacks or anything, and so what you're going to use stealth for typically is to sneak into private areas of various factions for the couple of quests that require you to do that, which are relatively few in number. The thing is, stealth is usually a bad idea because if you get spotted, and you likely will, though sneaking in at night will reduce the number of guards by the way, you will nonetheless lose reputation if you ultimately get caught. The way around this is to just put on a bit of gear, that is to say the chest piece in particular, of the corresponding faction you are trying to sneak into, at which point they'll just completely leave you alone. Those systems come up maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of the entire game, and then beyond that it's just things like using skills to bypass certain problems or access shortcuts. Like for instance, Vigor will help you climb up and through things, allowing you to bypass some of the more complicated paths. Lockpicking will often let you skip quest steps because instead of searching for a key, you can just pick the lock and be done with it. A lot of just little stuff like that is engaging enough for what it is, but is relatively bare bones in the grand scheme of things. And realistically, when it comes to the gameplay and world, the much more interesting part of it is the setting itself and the factions that they have built up here. So let's talk about a bit of that. So the factions. First up, we've got the Merchants Congregation, the faction that you are a part of by default. The Merchants Congregation is divided up into essentially 2 ruling families, the D'Orsays and the Devesps. There are other families like your own, the D'Sardays, but they serve the D'Orsays. Now, the D'Orsays are the ones primarily in charge, however, the Devesps, through underhanded cunning, are always trying to get on top. Each of these families rules the Merchant Congregation as part of a council from different sides of the way, basically. The D'Orsays rule from Serene and New Serene on Tier 4D, and the Devesps rule from a city on the continent known as Perrin, which makes a feature in the second game. Their job is pretty straightforward. They want to colonize Tier 4D to make as much money as possible, as the Merchants Congregation would imply, but they are also searching for a cure for the Malachor, but that is every faction, more or less. They are guarded, like many of the factions, by the Coin Guard, the merchant operation, who seems to be the primary military force in the land, which is dangerous at best, obviously, given the coup that literally happens, but the Coin Guard are, simply put, mercenaries, and they don't tend to have a ton of scruples, but some of them, like Kurt, your bodyguard, do. Then there is the Bridge Alliance. The Bridge Alliance are alchemists and scientists who are trying to get to the bottom of a cure for the Malachor the old-fashioned way by research and study. However, their methods leave a lot to be desired, as they are often brutal, which brings us to a good point. One of the things I think that Greedfall does really well with its factions, actually, is showing the different trains of thoughts and camps sort of within that faction. There are members of the Bridge Alliance who want to do what they do ethically, and there are members of the Bridge Alliance who are happy to murder, torture, and dissect islanders trying to figure out why they are immune to the Malachor. And that's true of most of the factions, but probably none more pronounced than Teleme. I really don't know how to pronounce that, but the religious faction. These guys resemble Puritans from, I would say, colonial America in terms of their faith, but truth be told, their faith is a little vague at best. The zealots of their order, in fact, think the islanders are heretics of some sort, which is especially funny if you follow through on their quest because of what gets revealed there. However, there are people within this group trying to do just regular missionary work, pushing islanders to convert to their religion, and just kind of all the usual stuff you see mirrored in our real world there. However, much of what they've got going on is trying to either peacefully or forcefully convert the natives, as they seem to think that the natives have put some sort of curse on people, which might be a cause for the Malachor. We're not done yet there, though, because then we have the Nauts. The Nauts are the, as the name would imply, nautical sailing faction. These guys basically run the ships, and they are interesting because of both how they do their recruiting, which often comes from children, potentially just straight up sold to them as workers, or plenty of other kind of messed up stuff, but they essentially recruit very oddly. However, they are good at what they do, which is sailing, and in fact they have all the typical technology you would expect from people in order to do this, but they keep all that stuff secret from the other factions so they can have a sort of chokehold on the act of sailing. And so it's pretty funny when the other factions get suspicious of them, but it turns out that they're just using stuff like an astrolabe as an example. And then last but not least, there are the natives. So the natives are interesting because you are presented with tons of different tribes of them, which all have different ways of doing things. There's a tribe that is all about trading and trying to ingratiate themselves with the factions on the island. There are tribes like the Red Spears who are just straight up at war with the Bridge Alliance, who has pissed off most of the natives around them. There are, of course, more warlike and rebel factions as well, and so there's just a lot of effort put into showing the different tribes and how unique they are, while all sort of still collectively being under their own banner. Now, one thing you'll notice with the natives is that they are often depicted with things like plant-like growths coming out of them, which seems to be a byproduct of bonding that they can perform to bond with the island itself, which is a feature of their donigads, I think they call them, which are kind of like shaman more or less, which is interesting to see. Now, every one of those factions has a faction representative as a member of your companions, as is often the case with these games. This is where we get Kurt, Vasco, Siora, Petrus, and Afra. Each of these kind of just wants to follow up on whatever their faction has going on. So Kurt's is probably the most important because his personal quests relate back to the Coin Guard and the incredibly important event that happens with them, and whether or not Kurt likes you is a big part of how that plays out. He has the most substantial quest overall just because of that outcome and how it's tied to the main story. Vasco, the Knot representative. He has a great quest kind of filling out what goes on with the knots and everything, however it doesn't affect the main story too much. Then there is Siora, the representative from the natives. She does a good job of both highlighting the struggles going on with the natives and the factions that have colonized here, but also is great at providing context if you keep her in your party that you might not get otherwise, because she can tell you about all the stuff the natives are doing. Then there is Petrus, the old preacher from Teleme, who is, I would say, a little more wise to the ways of the world than some of his more naive counterparts within that faction, but he is still a devout member of his faith. I would say he simply understands that there is such a thing as too far, and he's willing to help you step in and prevent that from happening. And then lastly, we've got Afra, a member of the Bridge Alliance, who is probably the most directly involved in trying to study what the natives are up to and how you might actually find a proper cure. Before somebody inevitably asks, yes, you can romance these companions besides Petrus. Kurt will only be available to female players. Vasco and Siora are player sexual and will be happy with whatever, and then Afra is only available for male Desardes. So if that's your thing, you can also pursue that, I suppose. But from there, let's talk combat. Combat is not this game's strong suit, to be honest with you. It's kind of bad and it gets repetitive fast. Essentially, what you're going to do is pick a play style, and then almost every combat from there on in is going to play the exact same way, but there's still a couple of things to know. Basically, you've got a few stats to watch out for. Health and armor. Characters often have an armor stat. Magic bypasses armor. Regular melee attacks do not. Doing damage to an enemy will typically eat into their armor unless you're using magic. However, that's a per combat thing. Once that armor's gone, it's gone. There's a couple abilities that can regen it here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty much just a one-time thing. There's also balance. You can get knocked off balance, and if you get hit like that, you're more prone to being like stunned or knocked down, etc., which will prevent you from attacking and potentially get overwhelmed. Everything else is basically down to play style. There are guns, but you don't aim them or anything. You just kind of generally lock on to an enemy and press a hotkey which activates the gun, and that does a lot of armor and stun damage. This is typically limited by things like ammo, but that can be worked around if you dedicate yourself to it. You have a basic dodge by default, but almost every type of playstyle adds a better dodge that moves you farther and is more likely to, actually work. As you make attacks successfully, you will build up fury, and then once you've done that, you can unleash a sort of big critical hit based on the type of weaponry you are using. Every skill tree for each type of ability here will typically give you an active ability that you can use provided you have the resources to do so in combat, like a big sort of paralysis on everybody with Storm in the magic tree, or a big attack speed buff from the final skill in the warrior tree, that kind of thing. Alchemy can let you do some interesting things like place traps as well as add elemental damage to your weapons and stuff, but it's a really basic system there as well. And at the end of the day, combat comes down to basically just spamming the attack button, building up fury, and then using that, and then you either have the stats to win or you do not, and there's really just not a lot of skill involved, truth be told, which is why the combat gets so repetitive so fast, and it's just a little bit mindless, to be honest with you. And having played through this game again, I can kind of more easily understand the reasoning behind them switching the combat system up for the second game, which takes a more real time with pause approach. This game has a pause option, however there's no real reason to utilize it most of the time because of the way things actually work. So, it's fine for what the game is, but it's not probably what you're playing this game for, is what I will say. That brings us to the DLC. This game did get one DLC known as the Devesp Conspiracy, and if you've been listening to everything I've told you up to this point, it should be pretty straightforward. The Devesps land on Tier 4D, concoct a plan to get at Constantine, the governor, and you have to put a stop to their scheming before it gets out of hand, and it's honestly a pretty short little DLC that doesn't add too much to the game besides some new enemy types and a few new items. And then we have the Steam Deck section. So the Steam Deck for Greedfall is, you can definitely play it, but it struggles. I don't know that I would enjoy playing it all the time on that particular platform simply because it's prone to issues like screen tearing, things like that. The text clearly wasn't made with something like the Steam Deck in mind, as this game predates it a little bit. It's clearly just not optimized for that game either, as despite having hardware requirements that are below what the Steam Deck has, it also unfortunately just doesn't run very well on the thing anyway. And so while it is possible to run it there, you would likely have to mess with it a lot to get it to a place you like it. And even then, I don't know that it's just the best experience there. So can you do it? Yeah, I wouldn't really recommend it though. That brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, the main positive for this really is the world that you are interacting with. This world and the setting are interesting. The characters and the factions and the things like that they've set up are interesting. It strikes on something unique that isn't something that you feel almost anywhere else. And while there are certain colonial magic themes in other games, hell, Pillars of Eternity even comes to mind, this game does it in a way that just feels very unique to this game, I think, which is ultimately why this game did as well as it did and got that initial burst of attention. Combine that with the fact that it has those classic RPG roots from things like, old BioWare RPGs, and I think you get the idea of why this game is enjoyed by people. However, it's got a lot of negatives, a lot of half-baked systems, frankly. The combat is just straight up bad and repetitive. There's tons of backtracking through areas. They try to alleviate that a little bit with some teleports here and there, but it's not always successful. Some of the skills and things are cosmetic at best because they don't ultimately change anything. And that sort of brings us neatly into our conclusion. Greedfall is a game with an interesting world and settings that ultimately was trying to be more ambitious than I think it really had the scope or ability to fully realize. A lot of the systems feel very surface level and half-baked, as I mentioned. Now, if those limitations, which were almost certainly budget constraints, don't bother you that much, then I think Greedfall offers an enjoyable experience for what it is. I have in fact put over 100 hours into it. But it's also certainly not revolutionary in basically any sense, and the primary reason you would play this game is because the world and setting are of interest to you. And if that is the case, then for the game's asking price, full price these days, of $35, it's pretty good. You can also find it on sale because it's been out for a while, so you can get it even cheaper than that if you'd like. But for what this game is offering and what they are charging, I think it's pretty much where you would expect it to be, and that's good. Which then, for the sake of the sequel, leaves us with one big question. Will they be able to expand these systems in a meaningful way while also expanding what makes this game the most interesting, which is its setting and everything as they switch from the Isle of Tier 4D onto the continent? Simply put, there is potential in that sequel if they can manage to stick the landing after an especially rocky early access period, which, given the time I plan on releasing this video, won't be too much longer from now. So hopefully you stick around for all of that, but in the meantime, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one or the sequel down in the comments below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.